Hello everyone, and welcome to the first in a new series of videos called Warhammer Artifacts of Legend, where we will go through an in-depth examination of the lore surrounding the magical items of famous Warhammer characters. This means we will look at the history of the character or characters as it relates to their artifacts, the powers and abilities of their said items, and discuss possible theories to their creation and origins if none are provided in the lore. For this video, we will be discussing the magical weapons and items of both Vlad Von Carstein, first Vampire Count of Sylvania, and his wife the Countess Isabella, a favorite duo among myself and other Warhammer fans. The items we will be covering today are the Carstein Ring, the source of Vlad's famed immortality, his sword which is called Blood Drinker, and Isabella's famous blood-filled chalice known as the Chalice of Bathori. Now before we dive deep into the items we will be discussing in this video, the first thing to understand about Warhammer lore is that things are very rarely clear-cut. Warhammer as a setting is the product of various authors and designers over many years, whose views or stories don't always align with one another. With that in mind, all the information I will be presenting today is my attempt to assemble those various and sometimes conflicting visions into a cohesive and relatively more complete understanding. All the information that will be presented has been compiled personally, since I like to let my understanding of Warhammer lore develop more naturally while reading original sources released by Games Workshop, as opposed to third-party sources such as wikis, which can be good but unreliable at times. That said, I will always try to make clear distinctions between lore information that comes from official sources and those which are my own personal takes and ideas. Today's information comes primarily from the various Vampire Counts army books, along with the Liber Necris, a supplemental lore book on vampire lore. Also used are the Black Library novels included in the Vampire Wars trilogy by Stephen Seville, and the Warhammer fantasy roleplay book called Knights Dark Masters. The Carstein Ring. One of the key factors to Vlad's near-complete subjugation of the Empire, the Carstein Ring grants the vampire who wears it power over death. As seen by the many instances, Vlad was thought killed and yet rose again to lead his campaign in pursuit of an eternal empire. He was beheaded, stabbed through the heart by one of the magically powerful runefangs of the Empire, and decapitated by a cannonball among other deaths. None would put him down permanently, however, as the ring would magically restore him from any wound, flesh or mortal. I apologize if the following portion of the video that covers the history of the Carstein Ring feels indulgent, going over an almost exhaustive history of the ring and its properties, but the reason for this is that many of the points that may seem non-relevant were included for a reason, and when we get to discussing the possible origin of Vlad's sword Blood Drinker and the Chalice of Bathori, hopefully all of that history will be relevant to you. The Ring of Vlad von Carstein is an item of great importance. To the men of Sigmar's empire, it represents their near annihilation and enslavement at the hands of the Vampire Count of Sylvania. To vampires, however, it is an artifact of such mythological power that it makes its wearer invincible, a feat desirable even for immortals. But to Vlad von Carstein, it was a mark of destiny, and the story of such a legendary item, both for its important place in history and the immense power it can provide, starts long before he was known as the Count of Sylvania. The ring's origins date back almost 4,000 years ago to the ancient human kingdom of Nehekhara, known in modern times as the Land of the Dead, and home to the Tomb Kings. It is also home to the architect of that civilization's destruction, Nagash the Great Necromancer. Nagash was the first practitioner and indeed the inventor of the evil sorcery known as necromancy. His experiments in the search for immortality led not only to the invention of this dark magic, but also to the creation of a potion that could grant eternal life. But his methods and obsessive pursuit of this goal led to his violent expulsion from Nehekharan society. Nagash narrowly escaped destruction during the uprising and fled Nehekhara, but his research was left behind to be consumed by the purging flames of the rival Tomb Kings. Although the majority of the kingdom despised Nagash, there were a few who secretly admired his work. Most important of those few was the Princess of Lamia, Neferata, whose father had led the attack on Nagash's city of Khemri. Neferata would secretly save much of Nagash's research and notes concerning his elixir of immortality and take them with her to Lamia, where she would rule as queen while her father became king of all Nehekhara and Khemri. Neferata then attempted to recreate Nagash's elixir, and her attempt gave birth to a new race of immortals who fed on living blood to survive: vampires. Neferata would then offer the remaining portions of her elixir to a handful of individuals, making them original vampires like herself, Vlad von Carstein among them, under his original name of Vashanesh. They also discovered they could spread vampirism to others by sharing their blood in a ritual called the Blood Kiss. though these lesser vampires that were created were weaker than themselves. As the numbers of vampires grew within Lamia, so did their appetite. Quickly, rumors of their hunger, indiscretion, and worship of Nagash spread beyond Lamia's borders, and the armies of the other kings of Nehekhara soon arrived to purge Nagash's taint once again. Secretly, for some time, Nagash had been in contact with the Trueborn vampires, and had taught them the magic of necromancy. But even with the dead fighting alongside them and the incredible powers granted to them by vampirism, the forces of Lamia were defeated, with only the original 7 vampires surviving to flee the destruction. They then made their way north of Nehekhara to Nagashazar, a fortress Nagash had established at the mouth of the Sour Sea. Impressed with their power, Nagash made the vampires generals of his armies. While it was Neferata who had ruled in Lamia, Nagash recognized Vlad as a born leader and natural tactician, and so made him ruler of all vampires instead of her. As a gift, and also as a symbol of his new position, Nagash crafted a magical ring for Vashanesh that would elevate his already near-perfect immortality to the point of near indestructibility also. This new stage in Nagash's conquest happened sometime between negative 1170 Imperial Calendar and negative 1163 Imperial Calendar, and the ring is given sometime in that time span. Something Nagash did not tell his new generals was that beyond just new regenerative powers the ring granted Vlad, it also bound all vampires to his service, compelling them to obey not only his command, but also Nagash's second-in-command, Arkan the Black. When they were sent to conquer Nehekhara in his name and found fierce resistance, they discovered Nagash cared little whether they lived or died, and so sought freedom from their figurative chains. Vlad enacted a plan to deliberately let himself be killed in battle, knowing the ring would bring him back from death. This, however, is an event that is told without much explanation by the Liber Necros' author Manfred von Carstein, so we are giving no explanation as to a possible plot hole regarding Nagash's influence through the Carstein Ring. It's likely Vlad surmised that the ring only granted this control over himself and all other vampires as long as he was alive. This is even supported in the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition book, Night's Dark Masters. But in my mind it still doesn't answer the question as to why Nagash's control was broken when Vlad allowed himself to be killed instead of continuing after Vlad would be revived by the ring. The Liber Necros tells that Nagash warned all the vampires would be cursed should they disobey his commands. But other accounts don't reflect his threat, instead say Nagash himself cursed the vampires, not that the curse was inherent to the contract enabled by the ring. As we go off on a little tangent here, it seems strange to me that Nagash, creator of Undeath and one of the most powerful wizards the world has ever seen, would create a magical ring capable of binding the vampires to his will, but overlook the fact that the said ring would bring back the wearer from death but no longer under his control. While Nagash is well known for his hubris and arrogance, I think it more likely that Vlad himself had attempted to reveal all the secrets of the ring, and found a way to manipulate or alter the ring's enchantment so that upon death and resurrection, he and the other vampires would be free from Nagash's direct influence. This is the first clue that Vlad von Carstein was a far more clever and ingenious opponent than most give him credit for. I bring up this point now because when we later delve into the ring's actual abilities, Vlad seems to have unlocked more of its potential over time. And this tampering with the ring may have been done in collaboration with some of the other Trueborn vampires, but I think it's unlikely. Neferata became jealous of Vlad after his appointment by Nagash. Abhorash had no interest in or skill in magic. Ushoran was a self-centered individual, kind of a prick, but also had little aptitude for magic at the time. Wassorin, I can see as maybe having the knowledge to achieve some manipulation of the ring, as he was the chief disciple of Nagash after Arkan the Black, but at this time he was utterly loyal to his master Nagash. Of the 2 remaining original vampires, Matmasi and Herakte, we have basically no information regarding them. There are indications, however, that Wassorin would later craft magical items that were similar in a fashion to the Carstein Ring, that they were meant to bind the barbarian chieftain and kings that surrounded the city of Morkane, which we'll come to later. But returning to the story of the Carstein Ring, after Vlad's planned first death and subsequent resurrection by the ring, the Trueborn vampires, now freed from Nagash's control, abandoned the Necromancer's conquest of Nehekhara, and fled to many places across the world. Concerning Vlad, known as Vashanesh during this time, eventually returned as Nagash had promised he would, and he spent the next few centuries testing the limits of the ring. Even if Nagash had truly died after being abandoned by the vampires, which seemed unlikely, the ring had allowed Arkan to control them as well. Who knew how many other favored servants Nagash had? who would be capable of turning the vampires into their slaves. Vashanesh set about mastering certain magical arts to make the ring his slave rather than vice versa. Of Vashanesh and his ring, we have no immediate knowledge of where he went following his desertion of Nagash, but his next appearance would be in Kislev sometime shortly after the destruction of Morkane, the capital of a new vampire-ruled kingdom. Called Strigos, this kingdom was established by Yushorn and his Strigoi bloodline after Nagash's conquest of Nehekhara ended in destruction for both warring parties due to the interference of the Skaven. With the destruction of Morkane, the Strigoi vampires sought refuge among others of their own kind, but they had long been despised by the other vampire bloodlines. When they came upon a vampire who lived in a small castle built upon the tundra of Kislev that resembled Nehekharan architecture, they were quickly slaughtered to the man. No dates are given for this interaction of unfriendly kin, but it is said to have happened months after the destruction of Morkane, which occurred in -200 Imperial calendar. Vashanesh once again disappears from recorded history until almost 1,000 years later in Sylvania, this time under the name of Prince Vladimir. A terrible sickness known as the Black Plague had secretly been spread by the Skaven in preparation for their invasion of the Empire. At the same time, the dead began to rise in Sylvania, and almost if timed perfectly, Prince Vladimir appeared in Sylvania offering to teach the man Frederick van Hal how to control the rising dead so that he might combat the emerging Skaven menace. The following conflict between the Skaven, the Empire, and the Undead is known as the Skaven Wars, and Prince Vladimir would mysteriously disappear right before its conclusion. Vlad's part in this conflict is largely unknown to the wider Warhammer world, and no mention of his ring is made in reference to any of its events, but when Vlad appears once again, it is in Sylvania, a province now ripe for the taking. With its marriage to Isabella Von Drac, Vlad became the Elector Count of Sylvania. Seeing the weakness the rulers of the Empire had shown since its division with the time of the Three Emperors and the Skaven Wars, Vlad sought to establish his right to rule Sigmar's empire as its emperor. The Vampire Wars began, and Vlad's ring played a vital role in his near-successful campaign to conquer and rule the Empire. While he may have had a legitimate claim to the throne, none among the other provinces would see an immortal vampire rule over them. Despite this, Vlad always offered clemency to those who opposed him if they would but lay down their arms and serve him. Very few did so. The Vampire Wars continued, and even when the men of the Empire secured a victory by slaying the Vampire Count and watching his army crumble when Vlad shockingly allowed himself to be beheaded once again, after his victory at Essen Ford, when his own blade was grabbed by the captive enemy general, every other vampire who had followed him was lost at first. Then a power struggle among his lieutenants occurred, with Posner, Vlad's most trusted soldier, emerging the victor. Posner was then surprised as he issued a challenge to any potential rivals when none other than Vlad von Carstein appeared. Vlad quickly cut down his former trustee with little effort and resumed his place. What's most interesting about this entire interaction is that no one within Vlad's entourage was aware of Vlad's unwavering immortality granted by his ring. They were clearly acquainted with the signet ring he wore on his finger, but were unaware Vlad possessed such a power over death. While not mentioned specifically in any tellings of this story, Manfred von Carstein was undoubtedly there, as he was a vampire sired by Vlad himself. And this is probably the event that piqued his interest and led him to discover its properties and later betray Vlad with those secrets. After Vlad's return, his campaign resumed as though nothing had happened, and each time he was struck down by a chance cannonball or the martial skill of the Empire's finest heroes, he rose again. It seemed an unwinnable war for the Empire, and perhaps it would have been if not for Manfred von Carstein. On the eve of Vlad's complete victory at the gates of Altdorf, Manfred snuck into the city and revealed the secret of Vlad's immortality to the Grand Theogonist Wilhelm III. And so a plan was conceived. Felix Mann, greatest living thief, would be tasked with creeping into Vlad's camp as he slept, and Manfred would conceal the thief with magic. Vlad awoke the next day to find the Carstein Ring gone, and in a fury ordered the brutal all-out attack on Altdorf. Though Vlad was an immensely skilled and powerful opponent, he was now vulnerable. While fighting atop the walls of Altdorf, the Grand Theogonist threw himself at Vlad, carrying them both over the walls and onto wooden stakes below. Without the ring to resurrect him, Vlad's arm crumbled around him, and Isabella von Carstein, in her despair, cast herself off the walls to join her husband down on the stakes below. The remaining vampires, now leaderless, fled, but the Empire's forces were in no state to pursue. And for a time the Empire was safe from the vampire threat, but soon enough other children of the night would seek to fulfill Vlad's dream of an eternal empire. The fate of the Carstein Ring after its theft and Vlad's demise has conflicting conclusions. According to the Vampire Count's army books, the ring was lost, and Felix Mann was never heard from again. The Vampire Wars trilogy, however, says Manfred later caught up with Mann, and violently claimed Vlad's signet ring for himself. The truth, however, is hard to know for sure. And at this point, some of you who are familiar with the end times notice that I did not include any stories that are told from that time period in Warhammer's universe, and that's for a specific reason. I personally find the end times conflicts too severely and too often with all the previous lore established, and the congruence of the previous 30 years of lore was a lot better before the end times came along, so that's why I tend to not include the end times. However, if you would like me to include the end time scenario in the future, let me know in the comments down below. But with that said, let's move on from the history regarding the Carstein Ring and on to the more specific details regarding its physical appearance, powers, and secrets that Vlad might have discovered with it in his possession for almost 3,000 years. The physical description of the Carstein Ring is almost unknown, as there is no official artwork and only a few brief written descriptions. Those two descriptions come from Posner, the aforementioned trusted lieutenant who attempted to usurp Vlad's position after his first public death as Count of Sylvania, and Manfred von Carstein in the Liber Necris. Before we look at the ring's described appearance, Vlad was actually known to wear two rings. The first is a signet ring set with a warpstone gem, and the other a simple black band. First with Posner's account. He wore an extravagant signet ring on his right hand with a garish gem set amid what looked like wings, the tip studded with precious stones. It was ostentatious. The gem is later described as dark, and Posner remarks the ring would definitely fetch an emperor's ransom. From Manfred's account, he describes the band as being made from some magical alloy, and that the ring was set with a stone of refined and enchanted warpstone. Most would assume that the Carstein Ring is the one with the warpstone gem. There is, however, a discrepancy regarding the Carstein Ring in the 7th edition Vampire Count's army book, stating, "The appearance of the Carstein Ring, as described by those who fought Vlad, was more contemporary in design. If indeed Nagash ever made such a ring, it is more likely that the Carstein Ring is a less powerful copy. Vlad demonstrated no particular skills of artisanship, so it is certain the Carstein Ring was not made by him. It is more likely that Vlad forced a thrall necromancer to create it or took it from its owner." This is supported by the Vampire Wars trilogy telling of Vlad's conquest of the Empire. The aforementioned signet ring is implied to be a copy, and the simple black band the original ring. I, however, would disagree with the army book's evaluation of Vlad's skills as a craftsman. We have no direct confirmation to go either way, but I believe the evidence constantly implies the opposite, that Vlad was constantly underestimated, both by Nagash and the larger overall world. Vlad had spent at least several centuries studying the ring and seeking to unlock its secrets in the period immediately after the original vampires desert Nagash, and, unlike the other original vampires, Vashanesh, or Prince Vladimir, or Vlad von Carstein, whichever name you choose to call him by, his early history was not spent in conquest or trying to build a new kingdom of the dead. For almost 2,000 years, Vlad remains hidden from the outside world, biding his time, but I also believe mastering not only the Carstein Ring, but attempting to replicate its amazing abilities. The Liber Necris, however, disagrees with both of these accounts, and says the elaborate ring with wings and embedded warpstone gem is the true Carstein Ring. And I will put it forward as the correct source precisely because in this case, the Liber Necris was written by Manfred von Carstein after his decades-long research of vampirism and Nagash. He did so while traveling in Nehekhara and Nagashazar while looking for the 9 books of Nagash. And Manfred is also likely the culprit who planned the theft of Vlad's ring and later reclaimed it from the thief Felix Mann. So having established the true Carstein Ring, let's go back to Manfred's description of the ring. Made from some magical alloy, the ring was set with a stone of refined and enchanted warpstone. This magical alloy is never described in detail, but the biggest hint to its composition in my mind is its creator, Nagash. After his exile in Nehekhara, Nagash eventually made his way north to the Sour Sea and there founded his fortress and laboratory Nagashazar, upon a mountain partially made of warpstone. Now Nagash was already immortal from his original elixir of life, but through consuming refined warpstone and the immense power it pushed through his veins, Nagash transformed his body with this immense power, allowing him to burn away his flesh and instead leave his withered body like a hard carapace of a diamond-hard material that looked like metal fused with bone. Nagash's diamond-hard body is not only nearly indestructible, but through the enchantments Nagash had weaved into the construction of his Black Pyramid, even if his body was destroyed, it would reform over time, creating a near perfect and undeniable immortality. So with that in mind, I believe the magical alloy the Carstein Ring is constructed of is the same material Nagash created his monstrous body with. And that similarly, the prime enchantment of the ring was to make its wearer indestructible, even if his body were to be destroyed. The immortality provided by the ring is, as far as we know, absolute. This holy relic, which is charged with the power to restore and resurrect a destroyed vampire's body. There is apparently no destruction final enough to keep the wearer from returning from the dead, and this power of the ring is fairly straightforward. But beyond the amazing restorative powers the ring possesses, Vlad unlocked more of its potential. On tabletop, the ring would also grant Vlad a +4 ward save, allowing him to not only regenerate wounds, but also prevent damage as well. In 5th edition, this rule was called the Master of the Ring, and the text says, Vlad knows the secrets of the Carstein Ring and uses the full extent of its powers. With that, we have come to a close in the very expensive history and examination of the Carstein Ring. And the sections of the video that follow should be much more straightforward. Meaning, we're not going to do an exhaustive history because there honestly isn't that much lore about Vlad's sword, Blood Drinker, and Isabella's chalice. If you guys are enjoying this video, please leave this video a like and hit the subscribe button if you want to hear more Warhammer lore videos. The sword known as Blood Drinker is almost as mysterious as its owner, Vlad Von Carstein. Throughout all the histories of Vlad that exist, none mention the origin of this weapon or even when Vlad acquired it. With that said, however, I believe the actual characteristics of the sword provided some clues whereby we might theorize a possible and maybe likely origin after we have covered its martial details. In most descriptions of Vlad using Blood Drinker, he is described as using it with a single hand, but also sometimes with both hands. Now this could describe a hand-and-a-half sword that is more commonly known as a bastard sword, which has an extended handle that allows the sword to be used in one hand and with a shield in the other, but also with both hands if the shield is lost, or if a stronger two-handed blow is required. The strength of a vampire, however, would allow Vlad to wield even the heaviest two-handed sword or greatsword with a single limb, but also give him the versatility to use it with both if the situation called for it, creating, in my mind, the possibility that Blood Drinker is a greatsword that Vlad simply chooses to wield single-handedly on most occasions. And some of his artwork kind of concurs with that. It's pretty ambiguous. It could be a bastard sword or it could be a greatsword. Beyond the physical, the most simple description of this legendary and magical sword is that it is vampiric in nature. All the various descriptions across the many editions of Warhammer Fantasy all describe its lust for blood, and its ability to heal the vampire wielding it through the bloodshed it creates. 7th edition states, every time the bearer of this sword draws blood, the life force of the victim is used to revitalize the blade's master, and acts as if the invocation of Nehek had been cast on them. The invocation of Nehek being a healing spell from the lore of vampires. But before Vlad's sword was given the name Blood Drinker in the 7th edition Vampire Count's Army book, it was simply known as the Wailing Blade. And this is because the blade of this evil sword is never satisfied with the amount of blood it drinks, and constantly emits a piercing scream demanding more, as stated by the 5th edition Army book. Many of the first-hand accounts of Blood Drinker attribute a sentience to the blade, saying, the blade was exquisite, quite unlike anything he had ever wielded. It was as if the blade itself possessed a will of its own, its preternatural balance and timing no more than its own selfish lust for blood and slaughter. After 4 dizzyingly fast passes, high and low parries and thrusts, the Wailing Blade was crying out for blood, and Posner found it almost impossible to lay the blade aside. It was inside his skull, crying to be fed. The thing was alive, a vampiric sword for a vampire count. It was a bloody partnership forged in the pits of Mor's underworld for sure. So circling back to the mysterious and unknown nature of the sword, known as the Wailing Blade and Blood Drinker, there are 3 clues in my mind that provide a possible origin. First is the sentient nature of the sword. Most magical weapons with some degree of sentience in Warhammer Fantasy tend to be those which bind and use a living creature as a fuel source for their magical power. The rune sword of Anarian Sunfang is said to have a trapped volcano elemental at its heart. Many Chaos artifacts also, like Archaon's sword, the Slayer of Kings, have bound demons in their making. Second is the vampiric nature of the sword. Blood Drinker has a never-ending thirst for blood and wails as a result of the denied hunger and will instill madness in the mind of a lesser wielder. To me, this would suggest that Blood Drinker was forged in the same manner as many other great artifacts by the binding of a powerful soul. But instead of an elemental or greater demon, it seems only logical based on its vampiric hunger that Blood Drinker was forged with a bound vampire soul. The wailing scream of an eternally thirsty vampire within would also help explain this unique vampiric sword. Third is the aforementioned replica of the Carstein Ring. Vlad von Carstein wore 2 rings, as mentioned before. One, the original ring crafted by Nagash, and the second, most likely a lesser imitation forged in an attempt to unlock or replicate the original ring's immense power. While the text suggests Vlad may not have had the skill, I believe myself, and I think I've provided enough evidence to support that the ring may have been made by Vlad, and by extension Blood Drinker as well. Blood Drinker is a powerful weapon, but not among the greatest the Warhammer world has ever seen, so likely would fall under the same level of craftsmanship as an imitation Carstein Ring. The vampire soul provided may have been one of the Strigoi vampires who sought out Vlad after the fall of Morkane while he was under the name Prince Vladimir in Kislev. The process of enchanting the blade so that any blood it spills is channeled to the wielder instead to feed the vampire soul within would probably not be the most complex magic, and I think within Vlad's skill set. He's more known for his generalship, but he's also a significant magic wielder. While this theory may provide a possible missing link to the Blood Drinker's origins, we also have no idea as to the fate of the sword after Vlad's demise on the walls of Altdorf. His corpse was buried, but nothing is mentioned as to his sword's final resting place. It could have been buried alongside him, but that seems highly unlikely, as leaving a dark artifact next to its owner who constantly rose from the dead would be a bad idea. More likely, what happened is that the sword was hidden away somewhere by the Church of Sigmar, and eventually, after the Colleges of Magic were established, moved into the vaults below the Light College's pyramid, a common storehouse for valuables and dangerous artifacts. With all that said, let me know what you think of my theory of Blood Drinker having a bound vampire with it, or even write down your own theories to its origin in the comments below. Finally, we come to the last artifact of today's video, the Blood Chalice of Bathori. This enchanted cup is magically always full of fresh blood, and through its power, Isabella Von Carstein can regenerate from almost any wound as the power of the chalice makes it seem like time itself was at her command. Those who dared confront her in battle would stare wide-eyed as her wounds healed within seconds, time seeming to flow backwards for the lithe vampire countess, as blood crawled back into open veins and alabaster flesh neatly seated in its wake. The goblet is an heirloom passed down to Isabella through the Von Drac bloodline. It originally belonged to Isabella's great-grandmother Bathori, the namesake of the chalice. It was perhaps inspired by the chalice carried by Wailing Harkon, Grandmaster of the Blood Dragons, whose own goblet carries the blood of his greatest opponents. But while the nobility of Sylvania was known to dabble in the dark arts and artifacts of disreputable origin, there is no information stating whether the Chalice of Bathori was originally a dark artifact before it came into Isabella's possession, or what I think is more likely the scenario is that it became corrupted by dark magic after her marriage to Vlad von Carstein. And examining the powers of the chalice would suggest that Vlad played some part in its corruption, as its power is almost a dark twin to his sword, Blood Drinker. Countless are the innocent souls whose life essence flowed into this bewitched goblet. Both items possess the unique trait of being vampiric in nature, using blood as a fuel source to power up the regenerative powers of their owners, and neither item shows an exceptional craftsmanship of raw power, but are instead ingeniously cunning in their design and the beneficial relationship to their wielders. Unlike the previously mentioned Blood Chalice of Wailing Harkon, Isabella's goblet seems to possess a strange power over time itself, as when she drinks from it, her wounds seem to reverse in time, blood flowing back into her veins instead of her body replacing wounded tissue with new flesh. And this particular in detail caught my interest. What if instead of being full of the blood of her victims, it is full of vampire blood, which has far more magical properties than regular fresh blood of a human? Vampire blood carries within it the elixir of immortality crafted by Neferata millennia ago in Lamia. Vampires are unique in that something about the elixir of immortality cuts the bond that anchors them to the flow of time. The Liber Necris establishes this, and Neferata's novel also reaffirms it from the point of view of Arkan the Black, who said of vampires, "They moved with a fluid ease that part of him fondly recalled and envied. It was the ease of immortality, the suppleness that came from being separate from the world's ebb and flow and time's anchor. This is the source of their eternal bodily youth." And again, Vlad seems clever enough to try and harness the elixir's immense power which exists in some part within every vampire's blood, small or great depending on the individual. The Chalice of Bathori being filled with vampire blood, what explains its strange power over time. And then by extension, we know the life essence the chalice consumes is to rejuvenate the elixir existing within the vampire blood it makes part of. We are reaching the end of the video, but I am currently in the process of writing a script for a video examining the elixir of immortality in great detail, and all the really interesting traits and kind of diverging lore surrounding it. As a conclusion, to all those who viewed this video, thank you so much. I really appreciate staying until the end. When I set out to start this new video series based on all the magical items of Warhammer's amazing characters, I planned for this to be a shorter video series, but as I examined the history of all of these 3 items, they had an underlying theme revolving around the Carstein Ring's history with Nagash and vampires, and I had lots of fun trying to fill those gaps and try to come up with theories as to what the origins were for the 2 items that we basically know nothing about except for their combat rules. So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. With that said, I'm Fohammer, and have a great day, guys.